Hello. Well, I'm the Edoardo Albert half of the talk, and we're actually brothers-in-law. We're married to sisters, and I'll give you some background to it before Paul gets into the meat of the lecture. 2002 was an important year for me because A, I became a father, but B, I discovered that there was some part of Britain that stretched north of London. I was born in London and brought up there, and I was a typical southerner. I actually didn't believe anywhere north of Watford actually existed. But I got married, and it turned out that Paul and Rosie, his wife, were doing a dig at Banbury Castle. I'd actually never even heard of Banbury Castle at that point. And they kept on saying, well, come up and visit. And after a while, I basically ran out of excuses for not going. So we drove up. And I still remember the impact when we were taking the road up north from Sea Houses, and I saw the castle there on the horizon. It was astonishing. Literally jaw-dropping. And I thought there is actually life north of Watford after all. And we went there, and Paul showed us the dig and went through some of the findings there, and they were astonishing, and parts of history that I at that point knew nothing about. There's a tendency in this country to, with history, to leave out the bit between the Romans arriving and the Romans leaving and the Normans arriving. There's not much on that. So I thought it was fascinating, and I said to Paul, well, why don't we write about it? So over the course of the last few years, we've done 3 books together, and The Perfect Sword is the culmination of that, particularly on the sword. I'll give you some background on how this sword was found. You may have heard that the original archaeologist at Banbury Castle was a man called Brian Hope Taylor, who excavated there in the 60s. He was one of the first generation, really, of archaeologists who took the science and actually made it, publicly known. He actually did a couple of series for ITV in the 60s, which were quite groundbreaking. He was an early TV personality, and he did the original excavations at Gething, which revealed Edwin's Hall there. And he also excavated at Banbury Castle, but he never published those results. And when Paul and Graham and the rest of the Banbury Research Project started their work there, they tried to contact him to find out what he'd done and so on. And Brian Hope Taylor was pretty uncommunicative. He said he'd excavated all of the West Ward. Actually, it turned out he'd only done about 10% of it. And anyway, he really was the opposite of helpful. But then, sadly he died. And he was at the time living in Cambridge. He'd been a very prominent archaeologist, but in the 80s he'd basically disappeared off the radar. And he'd become a semi-recluse. Some of his students still kept in contact with him. Ian Ralston, for instance, who's a well-known archaeologist now, would occasionally go and see him. But he was always very charming and polite when Ian met him, but he just didn't want to engage really. And then he died, and Ian heard that he'd died, and they asked, do you want to come and have a look, see if there's anything in his house that that ought to be preserved? And Ian went there, and he told me that he went in, and it was just everywhere. Basically, Brian Hope Taylor's archaeological life was everywhere in the house. There wasn't even a chair to sit in. I mean, literally, he'd become a hoarder, and all of it was there in boxes and files. There was a garage as well, which was full of everything, and that was leaking. I mean, it was just it was a lifetime of archaeology mouldering in the dust. And so obviously he thought, we've got to preserve this. This is one of the great archaeologists of the 20th century, and it's all just going to rack and ruin. So he got hold of Diana Murray, who was one of the heads of the Commission for Antiquities in Scotland, because no one else was expressed an interest. And she went along to see it and arrived, basically just as the house clearers were beginning to shove things out and put them all into skips outside. I mean, she was horrified, so all this, a lifetime's work was literally being put into a skip, and to stop it, she said she got out her card, her Antiquities card with her name on it, and said, "Stop! I am from the Royal and Ancient Commission of Antiquities. These are precious remains." So I said, "No." The guy said, "No, he's just a hoarder. We're just getting rid of the rubbish here." But luckily, she managed to stop it, and they took basically they loaded his archive into vans and took them up to Edinburgh. Some of them were water damaged and had to be frozen in an effort to save it. And going through it, they eventually realised that some of it was from Bamburgh, and that's when they called Paul and Graham and so on to come up and have a look. And so they went up, and you saw this huge, great warehouse almost full of remains, and they went through it and identified what belonged to Hope Taylor's Bamburgh dig, and included in that was a suitcase with bits of iron in it. What was it? 2 swords and an axe head, and Paul saw those, and they were wrapped up in tissue paper, weren't they? And in this case, Paul saw it and immediately thought that these swords might be, these were something else, these were something interesting. But luckily, they were also able to then identify it from various things, from his records, to be able to tell where Hope Taylor had excavated these, because otherwise they were just bits of metal in a suitcase. And you sent it off to the Royal Armouries, didn't you, to be analysed and have a look at. And it came back, and what's his name? The chap who?
David.
David, yeah, it came back and said these are extraordinary. I mean, one of them was. The complete sword is amazing, but the other one, which unfortunately is only half of, is amongst possibly the most complex and complex sword ever made. At that point, Paul told me this, and I was thinking, just how complex can a sword be? I mean, after all, it's a hunk of metal that you swing, really, isn't it? It doesn't, on the face of it, I never thought of them as particularly complex pieces of technology, but as you pointed out, they actually have to do a completely contradictory thing. They have to be hard, so they will take an edge and hold it, and yet they have to be malleable so that they don't break in battle. A broken sword in battle is a sure way to die very quickly. And how these early medieval smiths actually achieved this fusion of completely contradictory demands in a single weapon is what Paul's going to talk to you about now. And but if you want to learn more, I suggest our book. How do you scroll on this?
How do we change it there?
To that cross.
Yeah, just that one. Thank you. So it is already introduced. I'm Paul Gething from the Bamburgh Research Project. I've been a professional archaeologist too many years to remember, and I've principally dug up Bamburgh Castle, so 20 odd years, 25, nearly 30 years now. It's a research excavation, it's still ongoing. I don't really dig anymore, I'm far too lazy for that, but it's still ongoing in parts of the castle and outside. I've become more latterly a prehistorian. My interest is in prehistory, but I've been obsessed with swords for a long time. There are some human remains in this, so if anyone doesn't like seeing human remains, I suggest close your eyes. That's at Bamburgh, where everything's set, really, or the majority of things are set. It's 50 miles north of here-ish, sort of halfway between Newcastle and Edinburgh. It's on the east coast. The sea basically laps up to the base of it. And I think, one of the things a lot of people miss about Bamburgh in the early medieval is access to it is from the sea. So we quite often orientate ourselves from the A1. Everyone else in early medieval comes from the sea. So it's a port with a castle associated with it. It gives you an idea of where it is. and it's an incredibly important place in the early medieval. It's a preeminent citadel. It's got a king there. There are bishops in the early phase of Christianity who sit parallel to Bamborough. It's a cultural centre. It's a centre for warfare. It's analogous to. I was once mocked cruelly by my staff when I said on local radio that it was more important than Jerusalem. I've backtracked on that since. I think they're equally important in my opinion. So. That gives you an AP overhead view of the castle. So it's quite difficult to see, but the castle's there with the beach. The beach didn't exist in the early medieval period as we see it today. Most of the sand came in a great storm in the 19th century, 1817 I think it was, in a single night, apparently. I'm not sure I believe that, but that's what the sources tell us. And so it would have been a low, flat movement to the sea, down to the sea, where you could beach ships, shallow-keeled early medieval ships all day long. So that would have been a harbour-scape in the time of our sword. You can see the inner ward, the west ward, the bow hole. So the bow hole is our burial ground where we first started our excavation. The inner ward is where the majority of the castle. The west ward is where most of our excavations have been over the last 30 years. So the castle itself has got an extensive history. We've got very early Mesolithic finds, which are obviously from transient people moving through the landscape, right through to Victorian period, and there's still people who live in the castle today. So it's got a continuous history. It's analogous to a tell site. It's got continuous occupation all the way through. There's one brief period of about 20 years when no one lives there, but people are still visiting it and working there. So it's got continuous occupation, probably from the Bronze Age onward. In the bottom of the West Ward, we've found quite monumental Bronze Age buildings, just small segments of them, but people are clearly living there. There's extensive Roman, early medieval, when they started to build in stone, and then we just get the castle being built layer after layer. You can see there it sits within the landscape. That's the earliest map. This is where my part of the story comes in. I was a field archaeologist living in Gateshead. My friend, who I'd worked with for a long time, Graham Young, said to me, "Do you want to come to Bamborough Castle this weekend?" And I said, "What's Bamborough Castle?" And he said, "Well, come along, we'll see." So he showed me this map, and he said, it's from 1801, I think, this map. It says, the Old Danish Burying Ground. And he said to me, "What do you think's there?" And I suspected it might be an old Danish burying ground. So we went, and he said, it's never been identified, it's not been excavated. Do you want to come and do some digging to put some test pits in this weekend? So I was like, fine. We went up and had a look. There's 12 as I think went in 2 Land Rovers. So we took just our test pitting kit, went up to the castle and sort of set out to look at where it was on the map. Graham wanted to look at the top of the slope because he figured it's near the car park now, but at the time it looked like a promising site for a burying ground. I didn't feel that was right, so I carried on and said I'll go a bit further out. I went out. We had a small wager, and we I don't know what that's for. And after about 40 minutes, this was in the bottom of my trench. It's a long kist, it's only slab side, so there's no bottom. There is a bottom, but it's not made from stone, and it contained disarticulated human remains. I was very lucky in that one of the people who was digging with me on that day, it was a fauna analyst who was specialised in human remains. So she was able to identify very quickly that we were dealing with a human in situ, not in situ, but placed back after being disinterred. And then we started to find more bones. Altogether, we dug in the burial ground for over 10 years and found 213, I think, articulated skeletons various phases to it. There's 3 to 4 phases. Some of them are crouch burials, some of them are prone, some are supine. Very few of them have any kind of grave goods with them. No swords, 1 or 2 saxes, occasional buckles, occasional coins, very little in the way of grave goods. Orientation is east-west, as you would imagine in a traditional cemetery, apart from every now and again we get one that's orientated west-east. So, but just a fairly traditional early Saxon or Anglian burial ground. So that's a close-up on some of those, and you can see the articulation there, and the kind of and a better one there. This skeleton is in there really because it was the start of my journey into this. We had this skeleton taken away by one of our fauna analysts to Durham University, and she phoned me up very excitedly at one point and said, "You'll never guess what, that skeleton, the one without the head, he's been cut in two with a sword." And it was kind of, I was quite kind of surprised by that. But there's a clear sword cut from shoulder to the hip, all the way through. All the bones are severed. And she kind of said, "What do you think could have done that?" So that's really where I started looking at swords, axes, death, attitudes in death, warfare, all those sorts of things, all the sort of the interesting parts of archaeology. So a bit more of the burial ground there. But as Eddie alluded to earlier, whilst this was ongoing, Hope Taylor was busy dying and leaving his archive in disarray. He was a phenomenal archaeologist and a very great mind, and had some truly amazing excavations ongoing, but didn't really write much up other than the Evering site, which again is fantastic. It's a beautiful text, and the illustrations have no parallel really. But some of this stuff in there was bound to be Bamborough because he'd been excavating there over 4 seasons. We knew the archive was missing. There was one very short report written up in 61, I think. And then, as Eddie described, we got a phone call from Diana saying, "Come and look at the stuff." I opened a box and found, a suitcase, and found this little lot inside. The one at the top is arguably the least interesting, although as I've looked into it, I find it the most interesting of them now, but that's by the by. It's a broom axe, a broad axe, that's used for planking, basically, for making planks for boats. That's one of the main uses for it. So it's scarf welded, so it's got an iron back and it's got a steel edge. The technology in it is incredibly complicated, and I've yet to make a copy of it that's been successful. The one below it is a 6-strand pattern welded sword, iron cord with a steel edge. And the one below that is a 4-strand pattern welded sword with an iron core and steel edge. So the one at the bottom is very similar to the Sutton Hoo sword. So it's got that the 4 core, so it's kind of, the one in the middle, the 6-strand, is basically better, which came as a surprise, I suppose. You can see it there, it's in a pretty sad state, but once it was x-rayed, you can see the pattern welding is very striking down the centre of here, and you can see this is a repeat. You can see the 6 strands very, very clearly, and the steel core. See it there better. That's a close-up of it, and with the patterning in between, and it's a herringbone pattern, interrupted herringbone. So all we had at that point was a nice sword, 2 nice swords, and an axe. So I'd started to wonder where in Bamborough this comes from. So we knew it's from Hope Taylor's excavations, we knew it's somewhere in the castle, probably, but we didn't really know where. So we opened up a different trench in the castle. Trench 3 is our initial trenches in here. We opened up a second trench, which we called Trench 8, because it was the 8th trench we'd opened. That's how we numbered our trenches sequentially. And it's basically on the line of where Hope Taylor excavated one of his trenches in the 60s. So all we did was take out his backfill, sieved it, and recorded the sections. That sounds very simple, but it took us weeks and weeks because we had to be incredibly careful. And in the section edge, we found his original markers. So he'd still left tags in when he'd backfilled. And at the bottom, we'd got where he'd got to, basically. So we were able to accurately record Hope Taylor's trench. Whilst we were doing this, we also got a load of paperwork returned to us from Hope Taylor's archive, and I went through that fairly systematically. One of his sections had marked on it Anglo-Saxon sword, so I sort of had a vague idea that might be one of the two swords. And then eventually we found a pin in the context itself that said Saxon sword. So we could locate at least one of the swords where it was. And then later we found out that both swords and the axe all came out together from what he refers to up to in his archive as a hoard, as a blacksmith's hoard. So I think Hope Taylor, his idea was that when the Vikings came and burned the castle, someone had left this bundle in a forge somewhere. It had burned down and been lost because of the raid. I'm not sure I believe that, but but the idea that metal was bundled up and used and reused is clearly evidenced in all of or much of the stuff about pattern welding and swords and reuse. So we now knew sort of where the swords came from, who found them, what the context was for Hope Taylor locating these swords. We've got his original trench. So now all I needed to do was find out how to make a pattern welded sword, which I thought, how hard can that be, really? So I got started. So this is some of the processes that go into making a pattern welded sword. My first job was I went out into Rosedale, where I know a lot of the ironstone comes from, and we went and found ourselves about half a ton of ironstone. Brought it back to my forge. We built a model of a working Saxon smelt, and smelted the ironstone after we had to cook it first, break it up into powder, and then we cook it a second time to drive off all of the water from it as much as you can, and then it's ready to be smelted. So we smelted it. You can see in the centre that's our smelt there, and we smelted and got enough iron and a little bit of steel. So we just kept doing that basically until we got enough. And this is some of our balloon stuff in here. One of the interesting things, that's my son when he was 4. So employing copious amounts of child labour, just like the Anglo-Saxons would have done. So, and my wife was working for the health and safety executive at the time, so all our health and safety was fine. So then, once we've got our iron, we needed to make the core. You need to aggregate it. The technology, the principle behind it is that if you've got iron from an unknown source, it has impurity within it which needs to be disaggregated. So you need to spread that out along the length of your billet so that it doesn't promote breakage. If you've got too much charcoal or carbon in one place, the blade will snap. So you need to disaggregate it gradually throughout. So you've got the hardness from the carbon built into the steel and iron, but you also have the flexibility so it doesn't flex at one point in particular and crack. So that's the underlying technology. So each of these billets, you can see that the billets here are all part that will make one blade, or the core of one blade. So you can see the pattern. That's an interrupted herringbone pattern. 1, 2, 3. That's 1, 2, 3. 4. That's 7 strands. So I've obviously made a spare there. So that's the principal blade goes to there, and that will be a spare that I've made. I don't remember doing that, but that will be in case one of them breaks or anything happens to it. And then you laminate it, then you basically heat it up to forging temperature, hammer it all together, 2 at a time, and then all 3 of those billets get. The disheartening thing is sometimes once metal is heated to that, you lose the pattern, so you can't see the pattern welding it anymore. So as soon as you have to have a model of it written down on your anvil, and you have to have in your mind at all times which strand goes where, or you end up with a reflected pattern or a wrong pattern, and you don't know until the end. So you have to be on top of getting your pattern right at all times. Once you've got your core built and stretched to size, hammered to size, then you weld on a solid steel outer edge all the way around, and that gives you your cutting edge. So your centre provides the mass and the strength of the blade. That's made of iron, and then the edge is steel. So you've got a composite weapon that is ergonomically perfect, really, for warfare. So you've got flex in it, but the steel wouldn't flex on its own. The iron wouldn't be able to be sharpened. So you've got maximum cutting ability, maximum flexibility, and you don't get shock up your arm when you're hitting things with it if you've got a good balance. So that gives you the whole series there from currency bar through the whole thing to your edge being welded on, and then broadly cut to shape, so ground to shape in this case. Some of this I did with modern tools like an angle grinder, but mostly this is done by hand. How many strands? So there you can see a 6-strand one there, and that's what one looks like this one looks like. That one doesn't have a steel edge on it, that one's made entirely from steel, so that gives you an idea of what we've got. Then of course we got the Staffordshire Horde came up and gave us a whole new... I had some reconstructions made in a computer model about the Bamborough sword, and we always had plain hilts, because I was convinced that we would have a sort of, that the blade was the key to it, and that the hilt was kind of like, you might throw a bit of gold in there every now and then. And then when the Staffordshire Horde came up, it was like, it blew my mind. It was so grand, changed the landscape really of swords. And such fascinating stuff, but I know that's going to be talked about, so I'll skip over that. But I can broadly contextualise some of it, because the sword itself, the making of the sword, is incredibly complicated. It's complex, it's difficult, time-consuming, and a specialist skill. One of the things, one of the stupid things I also said was that it's analogous to something, the technologies would be analogous to something like a fighter bomber today. The technology is that advanced at the time. It's the most cutting edge of weaponry, and the technology that goes into making it is a jealously guarded secret process. Blacksmiths have always existed, weaponsmiths as well, it existed outside society. So you quite often get tales of blacksmiths being crippled so they can't leave, with Wayland for example, those sorts of things. In ethnographic parallels in Africa, you get blacksmiths who live beyond society, they live in a hut outside the village. So the blacksmith is a curious creature really, who makes these things, and the best blacksmiths would have been reserved by a king to make weapons and maintain weapons for the king's bodyguard, the retinue that sit around the king. So they would have been, I think, highly paid, well-sourced, well-resourced, but essentially unable to leave. So once you've got a really good smith, you hang on to them, and that may not always be through carrot. I think sometimes it's stick. Gives you an idea of what a warband would have looked like, and I think the idea that everybody's wandering around with a sword is not accurate. I think swords are a very rare preserve, and you would have a small group of people who sit around the king or a prince, and they all have swords, but not many other people in society have swords. They're rare to see. And I think one of the things I think about a lot, not anymore, but one of the ways I put it into my mind is in our society, we wander down the street, we never see a gun. We don't see anybody in military uniform, we don't do things that we don't want to or are not trained for. And this is the equivalent, really. These are the warriors. These are the SAS or the Gurkhas of the early medieval period. So they sit beyond society, and they sometimes might float through your village and take some of your stuff, but ultimately you don't really interact with them very much, and they sit in a different area. People don't really think about them very much. They think about themselves a lot. They're all self-obsessed, I think, and the idea of storytelling and boasting, and these are elite warriors who've been trained since birth, really. They're playing strategy games, they're wrestling, they're going hunting, they're doing these are people who are built for warfare. They're made to engage in warfare, and if they're not engaging in warfare, they're often engaging in mischief. So you really have to quite often go and battle someone elsewhere to keep your elite warriors busy and not rebelling. So it's a very complicated system, interwoven system of warrior nobility, and all those things come into it. Ultimately, it's about pay, though, I think, and swords are very, very valuable. You give someone a sword, they can never reciprocate that level of value. So you effectively have given them a gift that they cannot reciprocate. They can't return the sword, they can't return the value, so they're effectively beholden to you. It's a single warrior. We know that Bamborough was where the sword came from, was a cultural centre. It's a strong centre of commerce. People are coming there. They're bringing all sorts of things from the Mediterranean. We get blue glass, like you would get at Tintagel or somewhere like that. We're getting whalebone. We're getting gold. There's all sorts of stuff. And then this little thing popped up. It's from a 7th century context. And I didn't really know what it was. It's glass. I didn't really think about it. And then Rosemary Cramp came up and was looking through our finds, and she said, "Oh, this is interesting." And it was like, I basically said, "Is it?" So really? And she said, "Yeah, it's window glass." I said, "I don't think so. It's from the 7th century." And she said, "It's definitely window glass." And that you can see around the edge where it's been leaded in. And then the striations are to give it a purchase. So when it's been put in there, so she took it away with her, and then eventually got back to us, definitely window glass. So we started to be able to not only populate our warrior centre, but also put some nice little touches of finery around the edge. And so it's I just thought I'd put something in that Rosemary had done there, considering where we are. So the warrior we had cut into earlier, we kind of went back once we built swords and tested them and did a variety of things. And I think Eddie and I, we were talking in, where were we?
Possibly, Carlisle.
Carlisle, that's right. And we were talking about the same sort of thing about the sword and about making the sword. And at the end, a very nice chap came up to us and said that the burial that we'd got, I told the people there that they contained white quartz pebbles. Lots and lots of burials from the early medieval contained white quartz pebbles. And I just thought that they were bits of extraneous stuff that get lumped in with a grave. And he told us that in Revelations 2:17, everyone who dies and is resurrected has their name written anew on a stone, a white stone. And that was from the original Greek, I think he told us that. And it contextualised a lot of the stuff that we've been picking these out for years from, and suddenly it gives you a new, just a little sort of, a new little window back into the past. It was an incredibly important moment, just from a member of the public. He was a clergyman, wasn't he? I think a retired clergyman, who came and just offered us this little bit, this snippet of information. But that's just a little aside, really, just to. So the burials that we took out, the owner of the sword, I suppose I could put in a little bit about the sword would have been owned by an incredibly powerful man. It would definitely have been a man. He would have been at the apex of society, probably a king. He would have been a warrior. He may have been a retired warrior, as very few of them did retire. Some clearly did. But he would have been extremely wealthy, extremely powerful, and he would have probably had one sword that was his personal sword. I think when you're looking at swords as well, how much time have I got? Am I overrunning?
No, you're fine. Carry on.
All right. I think when you look at the Staffordshire hoard and you look at the quality of the workmanship that goes into those, and they're a statement. They're a really important statement, and that statement is, look at me, I'm extremely important. When you take out a pattern welded sword, you're making a secondary statement, and that secondary statement is, I am an extremely capable, well-trained, well-resourced, violent man. And that, I think, makes a lot of people pause for obvious reasons. So when you take out a sword like that, I think that your hand covers the grip, and all the idea of you being a polished garnet and gold person, and then suddenly you're into steel. And that transition is what makes these men so dangerous and so enigmatic as well. So the person who owned this sword would have been a king, but he would have been a battle king. They're not. You don't get to be king, but just. So if around this time we're talking about the person from the burial ground who got cut in two. We had isotopic analysis done on his teeth. We had strontium and lead analysis, oxygen analysis done on the bones, on his bones, and found that his origins are in Iona. So basically, he was born and brought up in Iona. He died somewhere around 630 from the C14 dating of him. So we've got someone who was born in Iona, died in Bamborough around the early parts of the 7th century. Coincidentally, Oswald and Oswy were exiled to Iona and fought all the way through Ireland, or the northern parts of Ireland, acquired a warband and came back to Northumbria and retook their kingdom with Dalradan warriors, so a warband from Dalraida, and they were joined obviously by Northumbrian warriors. So we've got what appears to be one of the original Dalradans who came back with Oswald. So I think there's a virtually certain chance that the warrior who we've got in our burial ground would have known that sword intimately, or the original of that sword intimately, would have been able to, well, probably not handle it, but would see it on a daily basis. And that's very rare in the early medieval period. You get to put a name to someone, and we don't know his name, but you can actually flesh those bones. And it's an incredible thing to know that, you know, on the day that you're digging something like that, that you'll get to a point where you'll be able to sort of visit the place where they live, and it's a rare privilege. We emptied the burial ground of all that we could, and when we started the excavation of the burial ground, looking at the people who made these swords and owned these swords, I'd sort of said to Graham that I wanted to make sure that every single person went back in the same hole with the same stuff, and we agreed on that on day one. We both wanted that, but when we got to the end of our excavation, the coast is eroding so quickly that even if we put them a few feet down, they would eventually have eroded. They might have given them a century, but they would have eroded out and be lost to the sea. So we came up with a secondary plan, and we approached the diocese and asked them if we could use the basement, the crypt of Bamborough Church, which is an Anglican crypt. So it's a church that would have been known to these people. It would have been probably the place where they worshipped. They are Christians. So we wanted to put them in the crypt. We got permission from the diocese, and then we put them in specially commissioned caskets, each one individual. So every one of those warriors, and I think it's a unique burial ground in that it's they're outlanders, basically, the people who are buried there. We've got people from North Africa, we've got people from Italy, people from Dalraida, we've got people from all over the known world at the time, all buried in one cemetery, and it's not the only cemetery. So I think my idea is that if you die as an outlander in Bamborough, they bury you in the outlander cemetery and you're buried facing the sea, so that your soul effectively can go home if you want to. That's a fairly prosaic reading of it, but that's where it led me. So we wanted these outlanders to be connected to the place that they were buried and still have the same possibilities. We stuck them in there. There's a board that you can type in the number of each of the, and you can see the burial all the results from the faunal analysis, their dental records, all those things. So you can investigate. You can have a look at any of these people as if they were still buried in the ground, but obviously they're now in hallowed ground, and it's screened off. You can't actually go in, so they'll not be looked at again. But there's an extensive suite of sciences done on them. So the sword now is, we know how it was made, we know where it was made, we know why it was made. There's still a lot, I think, that we can do. The Staffordshire hoard is, there's any number of things we can do with that, and I've lost sight of what I will be doing next. But you kind of just things like scabbards. It's such an overwhelming the complexity of the technology that goes into it. It's beyond what the Japanese are doing with their tamahaginis and their hamon. We get all that, but it's built into two edges of a sword. And I think I was lucky enough to spend some time in Winchester with the Gurkha regiment, and I did some smithing with their camis. They have their own dedicated smiths who maintain their weapon sets. So their cookery, their fighting cookery, maintained by a dedicated smith, and he uses basically a little charcoal burner, and his anvil is smaller than my travelling anvil. So it's kind of, and he maintains all of the regiment, or the half regiments, cookery on that one set. And I trained with him, observed him, and became friendly with him, and was allowed to mess about with him. And he talked me through this kind of the mindset of the Gurkha when they have, when they take their weapons out, what they use and how they, and it's very clear that there's something similar going on to what the Anglo-Saxon warriors are feeling. That the idea that it's a serious business, that they're personal, they're passed from father to son sometimes. So you're getting that continuity, but you're also getting something that's. It was interesting listening to the idea of a slaughter knife, because that's kind of, I think that's, if you're a modern warrior and you're reduced to bringing out a cookery, something's gone seriously wrong. But the Gurkha do not think like that at all. They are more than happy to engage in battle with cookery. And that's a difficult mindset to put yourselves in. And I think unless you've been where they are, we'll never understand that. And I think that's where the sword is. It's in that liminal space between sort of death and life, where it's all that sits between you and a fairly bloody, brutal death is your sword. But then, obviously, when your sword breaks, as they inevitably did, you're reduced to your killing knife, your slaughter knife. And I think the sword also, it has a multiplicity of uses. You've got your spear to start off with your. If you're in a shield wall and someone's hacking at you with an axe, you don't really want the clumsiness of a sword. You do want a killing knife, a slaughter knife, so that you can get through. And then when the shield wall breaks, then you take a sword out and you give yourself some room. So that's when you get the weight of it, the Spathus type swords, you want edge, some of these swords are only sharpened from sort of here downwards. And this is blunt, so you can hold it, and especially when you get into the big sort of bastard swords of the 13th century, where you're using it almost like a spear. So some of these are not sharpened here at all. And I think the idea, what's that chap called who told us about the spinnings?
Yeah.
His name, I've lost his name, but he was yeah. And he was saying that he'd done a variety of experiments, and he does live fighting with live swords. And he has a technique where he palms the hilt. So he would just have 3 fingers on the handle, and then the hilt, which is why some swords have really tiny hilts, and they look like they're made for children. They're not. They're made for warriors. And and you can literally spin the blade, so you can get an arc. And they describe it in the shield walls of the Saxons when they're fighting the Normans at Senlac. And they get a fluid motion that's almost like a figure of eight, and you can move your sword and still keep your shield. And your shield could come back up and you're still ready to fight. And it's a very ergonomic way of using it. But it also gives context to why people would need different sets of furniture for a sword. The blade is constant, the furniture changes. So when a sword gets passed, as we heard earlier, from father to son or brother to brother, the blade is what carries the history, it carries your lineage, it carries your father's memory, your grandfather's memory. The hilt is yours. So all of that furniture is what you want. If you fancy a bit more gold or a bit less gold, you get somebody to make this stuff for you, and then it becomes yours. But it's also made, ergonomically, it's weighted. So these strips in here are they're not designed for beauty, they're designed for ergonomics. So you can shim those up and you can make it slightly heavier at one end, so it gives you an tactical advantage. And that's going on all the time. They're taking these apart, that's why they're composite pieces, and you can put another shim in and it will give you ½ inch of reach, because the flex of the sword in your wrist is not stressing you. So they're kind of there's a whole PhD done on this by Peter, I can't remember, it's Peter Johnson, and it's brilliant. It's in Swedish, unfortunately, but it's kind of, there are translations of it, I think. And talking to him about the symmetry of the mechanical action is kind of, yeah, it's an incredible thing. I think it's the most comprehensively ergonomic piece of fighting equipment we get. You can't really do much with a spear. You know, with a killing knife, they're incredibly useful, but a sword it's a confluence of science and aggression, really, and they're amazing things. Right, I think I've dribbled on enough.
Thanks very much indeed.
Well,